Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today. I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Jarrett. I'm the Business Development Manager for SHL Middle East and Africa. I have been with SHL for over 3 years now, managing strategic partnerships across the region. I'm pleased to be joining you all today to moderate this exciting session. I would like to welcome our speaker, David Edwards, who has over 20 years of experience in the field of occupational psychology and consulting. David is a chartered occupational psychologist. He is a chartered scientist and an associate fellow at the British Psychological Society, BPS. Today, David will be sharing with us the latest research and insights on the future of job interviews using artificial intelligence and how these tools will reshape and change the HR landscape now and in the future as well. For the benefit of this webinar, if you have any questions, we would appreciate if you can keep them coming and put them into the chat box, please, below. And definitely we will aim to address as many as possible towards the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome David to start his presentation. David, over to you when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Diala, and welcome everybody. My next slide was to introduce myself, but Diala's done such a fantastic job that I don't have much else to say other than my main fields of interest are talent management and the whole talent management cycle and the identification of high potentials, how to develop them, how to enhance organizations with their talent. So there's the main things I'm particularly interested in. So let's move to the specific subject of today's session. We are going to discuss today interviewing, and it is the one talent assessment technique that everybody has heard of. I'm sure we've all been to an interview and possibly even delivered an interview ourselves as an interviewer. It's the most widely used technique within talent acquisition processes. We're also probably aware that not all interviews are created equal, with the effectiveness of the technique dependent on a multitude of factors, from the form of the interview to the effectiveness of the interviewer. They're just some examples of the factors that can influence how predictive, how effective an interview can be. So why then have a session on interviewing at all in the first place if it's so widely used? Well, there has been a step shift in how interviews can and have been conducted in the recent past and going forwards into the future, with many organizations now considering the use of the latest technologies to enhance the process in terms of time efficiencies, predictivity, and aligning the method with the shift of other talent management practices towards the digitization of talent management, which of course aligns with many organizations wish to digitize the workplace overall. So clearly there are some reasons why we will want to discuss interviewing and the way it potentially is going to change going forward in the future. So in terms of the agenda today, to begin with, we will look at the interviewing technique through the ages, in terms of how it's been delivered, how effective has been found to be, and the factors that have influenced how effective interviews can be and how predictive they are. We will then introduce ourselves to video interviewing technologies and how this can help us reimagine the interview process. We'll go on to look at how latest innovations such as artificial intelligence can and have been applied to the interview methodology to provide benefits to the interview and the overall talent management practices. There are, of course, certain requirements to making artificial intelligence work effectively and certain pitfalls that need to be avoided too when implementing. We will cover some of those aspects too. As Diala has said, please do ask your questions by putting them into the chat facility and or waiting until the end when Diala will take questions from the audience. We will attempt to tackle all these questions today after the presentation, and I'm sure, inshallah, we'll be able to do that for you. So then let's take a look at interviews through the ages. Interviews are the most frequently used tool in the world. So the interview has been around for a very long time, with evidence of such techniques being used as far back as the 19th century. They're almost the most frequently used assessment tools, with some countries reporting anything from 80% to 100% of organizations using the techniques with candidates. And so why have they been so popular? Well, candidates have typically perceived them as fair compared to other methods. So some countries have also found that they do not increase adverse impact, making the technique very important for this reason within some countries where there's a focus on these types of processes. There are varying types of interviews, from casual and unstructured interviews to very structured interview techniques, short interviews to long interviews. Now, opposing research suggests that interviews may not be particularly valid predictors of performance, while others have found them to be especially valid under certain circumstances. In fact, factors that improve interview predictivity have been found to be some of the following. Using the same interviewers throughout a particular process may enhance and ensure the reliability of ratings across an interview. Training your interview as well to use the best practice techniques and try to avoid any of the bad practices that creep into interviews. Structuring the interview, with structured interviews being at least twice as valid as unstructured. We should keep these types of factors in mind when digitizing or attempting to digitize an interview experience. You still need to apply the best practices even when digitization is actually implemented. Have a look at this particular statistic. It's quite a sad statistic for unstructured interviews. So in this particular large study, after obtaining basic information about candidates' abilities, standard interviews only accounted, or that's standard or unstructured interviews, only accounted for 8% of the differences in performance and productivity. So think about it this way. Imagine that you've interviewed 100 candidates. You've ranked them in order from best to worst based on your ratings, and then measured their actual job performance. You'd be lucky if you put more than 8 of them in the right spot in terms of where they rank, based on unstructured interviews with no particular structure and no particular standardization. So interviews can then be terrible predictors of job performance. So applying best practices to the method and facilitating the structuring and standardization of the interview process can only improve matters. In studies of structured interviews, it's been found that correlations can come in as high as 0.5. At least 25% of work variance can be then predicted by a well-structured interview, which is quite impressive, and can be predicted with such techniques. And so it makes it an effective and important technique for talent management professionals in that it can be predictive and it is acceptable to candidates who see it as a fair process. So what about the biases that can creep into interviews? And some of them can be quite serious. Some of them, although you might find initially amusing, are very serious indeed because it affects the candidate's ratings. First impression bias. We may already do this in our day-to-day lives without realizing this, but humans being humans, we have these biases, and first impression bias may mean that you have a very quick impression of somebody, which is very difficult to shake. No matter how much evidence there is from the subsequent interview, it's hard to shake that first impression of somebody, which typically you perceive within the first 3 to 4 minutes of meeting them. So first impressions are generally not particularly accurate. There's also the similar to me or cloning biases, whereby people tend to like people like themselves. Surprise, surprise. Which means, of course, that may affect ratings in interviews because you're going to rate people who are very similar to you. There's also other interesting biases, such as confirmation bias, whereby you've already decided on someone very early in an interview process, and so now you're just trying to find evidence during the interview to confirm your thoughts about them. So you're not really actively assessing them at all. Some other types of very interesting biases may be the attractiveness effect, whereby currently the research suggests that if you're a particularly attractive person, attractiveness being all relative and subjective, of course, you will be rated up with an interview if the interviewer finds you attractive. Not a very good effect at all in an interview. And other things such as body weight bias, such as research has shown that people with body weight issues may be rated down in an interview, which would be a terrible thing and totally subjective and biased, even to the fact that a research study suggests that sitting with someone with a body weight bias also affects your ratings. Now, I'm showing you these biases because they're not fair, they're not good, they're not positive. They should be eradicated from the process. So any way of managing a process to reduce or eliminate such biases can only have a positive outcome. A large survey of bias within hiring processes also just portrays a little bit of a negative picture at the moment. So when asked about whether companies tend to have bias in their hiring processes, many candidates saw that as the case. So 59% of respondents suggested they agree somewhat that there is bias in hiring processes, with 27% agreeing strongly that that's the case, with very much smaller numbers perceiving no bias within a hiring process. So as organizations, we do have some considerable work to change candidates' perceptions of the hiring process and make them perceive and be fairer within the hiring process itself. So some interesting information here about biases and how people perceive hiring processes. Clearly, the methods we use must reduce these types of perceptions. So with this being the case, with the shift to video interviewing, this can bring its own set of perceptions and biases with additional stresses affecting the candidates, which we have to take into account. So, for instance, background and environment, new sources of bias for your candidates, potentially. Obviously, when they come to offices, the only biases you can really have are based around the work environment. When they're actually being interviewed, potentially in their own homes, a new set of biases may occur, humorous or not, that may affect people's ratings. So clearly, shifting to video is something that is new, we should consider and make sure it's implemented properly, but also consider how this may bring new challenges to the interviewer and the interviewee. So let's then look at the current state of interviewing. Some interesting statistics to start. So current research suggests that 78% of thriving employees say they have had a positive hiring experience, compared with 30% of non-thriving employees, people not doing particularly well in their roles or in the organizations they're in. 74% of job postings required skills changes over time, and this is continuing with dramatic changes in the work environment, the skills required. And the number one concern for CEOs has been found to be the hiring of talent. So interviews and candidate selection really does matter to organizations, and to do it well. However, there's an additional complexity now to interviews and other hiring processes, in that the job-seeking behavior of candidates when looking for a role has perceptively changed. They have different expectations now from a recruitment process. The traditional way that candidates may have looked for roles would be that they would research companies first, shortlist the jobs to those companies they're interested in applying to jobs for, then applying for the jobs, then speaking to the recruiter. So that's your typical or traditional way of job search for candidates. However, now they've changed the way they do this into that they will actually apply for jobs anyway. They will apply for as many jobs as they can potentially, and then speak with the recruiters. Then they would research the companies after speaking to recruiters, and then shortlist the jobs that they want. So essentially, that takes the onus away from you just accepting them to the fact they may not accept you as an organization, but you wouldn't know that until you've offered. So this fundamentally changes the expectations of the hiring process because it emphasizes the need to be efficient in your processes as more people will apply for less roles, have a good, positive, and informative experience because candidate experience is imperative because they will be assessing you and not just you assessing them in the process, especially when it comes to job offers, if they have many. But it also means you have to be able to have a quick turnaround for your decisions so you don't let your best talented candidates go to somebody else because you took too long to offer. So there's many different types of challenges in the current hiring arena and things that you really do need to consider in terms of the challenges you have, which are changing. Some other interesting statistics. So 54% of companies believe quality of your hire improves when hiring managers and talent acquisition professionals collaborate effectively together. So the hiring manager works with the talent acquisition professional so they can make sure that they get what they want. However, a downside to this is 58% of hiring managers report they don't have the data they need to make the hiring decisions. Although they work together well, they don't seem to have the data needed to make those decisions. And 65% of those hiring managers are not satisfied with their recruiter's impact on the business. So this potentially means that it's intuitive, of course, but it potentially means that things have to change a little. We need to change the provision of pertinent data in terms of the speed and the accuracy and the relevance of the data to the hiring decision. So things are changing, and the way that you deliver data and the types of data hiring managers need is changing too. Unfortunately, currently, this need for data isn't being serviced. So currently, the data on turnaround or average time to hire shows that time to hire has increased by 84% in the past decade. So it's taken longer to make decisions about hiring. And the average time to hire is 33 days. And the diagram on the right here I'm showing you does suggest that there's quite a number of bottlenecks in the hiring process, with HR screening and interviewing making up a significant proportion of the time, not all, but significant. So if you could increase the speed of gathering such talent data without reducing its predictivity, that could go some ways towards alleviating the issues. So digitizing some of the process and using the latest technologies to speed up the process can only be a positive thing if implemented properly. What are candidates telling us? Well, transparency and communication tend to be things that meet their needs. So 58% of candidates feel that a good recruitment process experience will make them more likely to accept a role. So again, going back to the candidate experience, having an efficient process, but also one that gives candidates a good experience means they're more likely to accept your offer. Candidates who felt the overall hiring process was fair were more than twice as likely to want to increase the relationship with the organization. So an interesting experience, but also one that's perceptively a fair hiring experience, are more likely to get you the top talents once you make them the offer. There's also a 30% decrease in resentment when feedback is provided to candidates. And that's not just successful candidates, that's candidates who maybe didn't get the job, who will go away still with a feeling of a positive experience because they've been given feedback about how they did. How many organizations just don't contact unsuccessful candidates? So fairness, feedback, and ethical hiring processes are a differentiator for good employers. Of course, we also have to consider the new normal, taking into account such factors as, or adding things into the pot, that the world of work has and is fundamentally changing. It was changing pre-COVID. COVID has just sped up this process. with more remote working and flexible working likely to become more prominent and more desirable to candidates when looking for roles. So this seems to suggest that the time for video interviews and digitization of the hiring process appears to have arrived. So let's first then try to demystify the video interview format and explore what it really refers to. So video interviews come in a number of formats. Video interviews such as asynchronous interviews refer to interviews where an interviewer is not actually present at all, but reviews candidates' responses to the questions at a later time. This means the system provides candidates with interview questions. These can be text-based or by video that the interviewer has created previously with the questions, asking the questions. The candidate responds by recording a video on the system of the responses to the questions. This is later reviewed by the interviewer. And there may, of course, also be some artificial intelligence scoring methodology applied to various criteria within the response to see if it actually links to the things required from candidates. Live video interviews are synonymous with the traditional face-to-face interviews, where an interviewer does actually interact with the candidate. However, the video interview system itself should be different from the most widely used communication systems like Zoom or Teams, and it should provide some advantages for candidates and for interviewers that allow for an effective interview experience. Virtual simulations, which is the third category, are things such as virtual assessment centers, virtual work samples. We're not really covering those today, but just to let you know that these are also being digitized. So it shows that more and more of the talent management processes and hiring processes, etc., are actually being digitized, and the popularity is much more likely to rise than not. Let's then take a look at asynchronous interviews first. So asynchronous or on-demand interview systems allow for a large volume of candidates to be assessed in the most effective times, as there is no need for a human assessor to be involved until later stages. The candidate records and uploads their responses to the questions asked. These responses can be reviewed later, and some of, or if not all of the scoring can be automated through the use of artificial intelligence. More on this shortly. There are clear benefits, and that interviewers can then review the candidate's responses as much as required to ensure nothing is missed, but the technology should also be designed to make it easy for candidates to use, and there should be online support for them throughout the process. And of course, the benefit to the organization is larger numbers of people have been put through the interview process and assessed against the criteria. And so there's a large list of people who you can choose from to go to next stages using objective, valid data gathered by the process itself. When it comes to live video interview systems, of course, these are real-time evaluation of candidates, just like a face-to-face. There is an actual interaction with the candidates. However, it, of course, should provide various benefits over and above a typical face-to-face interview. The whole interview, of course, could be recorded to be reviewed at a later time. However, the way that video interview systems should be designed should make it easy to review this later anyway. So observations of certain behaviors or certain evidence related to competencies can be tagged. This would allow interviewers, when reviewing interviews later if they wish, to again point at these useful pieces of information that have already been tagged, which means they don't have to just go and simply rewatch the video, which could take them hours. So this is an intelligent way of reviewing the interview data later to make sure your notes and your ratings are validated and evidenced by what really happened in the interview. These are things that face-to-face interviews don't allow you to do. So actually, live interview systems can be effective if they also allow for the application of the best practices that we've already talked about earlier, such as structured, standardized, etc. But applications of such systems is not initially easy. And I'm going to talk more about that again shortly. The final area then to consider here is, which we're not going to go into in detail here, but maybe part of a webinar we might have in the future, is the other types of assessments that are virtual now and are being digitized and are using the latest artificial intelligence scoring techniques as well, such as virtual assessment center technology, virtual work samples, etc. These can play a dramatically positive impact on the hiring process and the internal promotion decision processes going forwards. More about this at a later date, but you will see more and more of this as talent management becomes more digitized to be time efficient, cost efficient, and turn around information that's predictive in more quick time. So how do we then make the transition from your traditional to your video interviews? Let's go through some steps and considerations and take a look at what technology considerations need to be made as well. So first, step one, the technology itself. When implementing any video interview system, the applicant's experience must be one of the paramount considerations. Candidate experience, as we've already mentioned, is important, so any system should be easy to use. Asynchronous interviews, of course, that's especially important, with an intuitive and easy to use interface, so candidates don't have to worry about using the system, they just have to concern themselves with performing to their best in interview. And also that means, of course, it must be easy to access for them too. It also needs to ensure that candidates feel they can provide their best responses to questions asked. So any asynchronous system where they have to record their own interviews should give them the opportunity to re-record it if they don't feel that they have done the best they can in the first instance, to ensure that they feel they've given their best. In terms of live interview meetings, the candidates need to feel that it's little different from the experience of a face-to-face. They need to feel that they are literally there in the room with you, conducting a fair and structured interview process. So applicant experience is critical, but so is the interviewer experience. So with asynchronous interviews, the review of the candidate's responses and all the access to the ratings generated by the system later should be easy, efficient, easy to understand, so you can make quick decisions based on that objective data. So there must be clear benefits and functionalities that make it as easy as being face-to-face with candidates. So with the face-to-face interviews, some functionalities should be expected from video interviews. So for instance, for interviewers, the questions should be visible on the screen to an interviewer so that they can always remember which questions they need to ask and which questions they have asked already. There should also be potentially some probing questions that can also enhance and probe down to specifics once the candidate has responded. There should be online behavioral indicators visible to interviewers only so that they can make sure that any ratings they give are aligned to the types of behaviors we are looking for a certain competency that's being interviewed for at the moment. And of course, ratings are made easier then and can be applied on the system whilst the interview is being delivered. Additional interviewers can be invited into the meeting if the interview is a panel format. So there should be an option of inviting in other interviewers to the same session if it is panel. And it is critical that a system allows for note-taking so that you can validate your ratings and show justification for your ratings post-interview to other people when you're comparing your ratings against different candidates. These are just the practical considerations when you're considering the interviewer themselves. Also, you need to consider the security features of any system. So to ensure that interviewers can keep track of the candidates' behaviors during the interview to ensure there's no issues arising, an interview technology should also allow you to use the latest techniques to make this easier for the interviewer. Such technology may be proctoring technology, where the system can identify that a candidate potentially has switched to another tab for some reason. So you know this, they can't see that you know this, but it is a red flag. And it's something maybe to consider later. So in summary, any technology, when you're considering implementing video technology, should make the candidate experience positive with an intuitive user interface. It should make the assessor's job easier in assessing the candidates in the best time, whilst ensuring that best practices can still be used and adhered to ensure that the interview is as effective and predictive as possible, just like your traditional interview. And it should make it easy for you to monitor the candidate's behaviors during the interview as well. So making that transition to a video in terms of the experience is also a consideration. It's a slightly different experience now for a candidate. It's not like going to your office. So how can we consider this? Well, factors to consider in the online hiring process is that in face-to-face traditional interviews and assessments, the candidate's likely to gain some sense of your organization because they've actually had to come to your offices and your work environment. They get some of the experience then of commuting to your offices. They may even get some chance to meet individuals they may be expected to work with if they were successful in being selected for the role. So how do we try to provide a similar experience, or at least some pertinent information about such things, so that candidates can experience what it's like to be in the workplace, can actually understand the values of your organization, and then how can we provide them with a sense of what the organization is all about? What's it like to work at the organization? So the candidate experience needs to be seriously considered even prior to the interview itself. Well, so what have organizations typically done about this type of thing? Well, the truth is that through research into this area, we at SHL have learned a lot about the importance of the candidate experience and what is important and effective in enhancing it for you. So SHL has got online digitized methodologies of enhancing the candidate experience based on the latest research around this. So essentially, things that have been seen in the past, standard candidate experiences, what you might find is that initial candidate experience initiatives have tended in the past to focus too much on keeping the candidates happy and satisfied, rather than focusing on whether or not they feel that what they're receiving is valuable, the information they're receiving is valuable. It turns out from the research that value is a much more powerful driver of engagement and commitment to the business. The fact that they've been given valuable information about what your company is and what it does. We've also come to realize through the research that it's not about just pushing your brand message in when you're starting to engage with the candidate before the assessment. Rather, you have to design experiences that really pull them in and are interactive, that really allow them to engage with your business and to interact with your actual branding or your actual values. And again, the loyalty and enthusiasm we see from candidates really comes from them feeling they've had valuable information, they've engaged with the business in some way, and also it's fast and focused feedback they receive. So there's some things to consider when actually just engaging with the candidate even before the interview and providing that differentiated candidate experience, which will set you, differ you from your other organizations and put you at the top of their list when it comes to accepting roles. So thinking about the entire interview experience then, there are also other things to consider. So for instance, do your communications work for a virtual process? What stresses will candidates have at home that they don't have when they come to the office, and how can you alleviate those? And how do you put a candidate at ease in a video interview experience? Well, things that you can consider in terms of an introduction to a video interview, for instance, is making sure that the interviewer is guided into building a positive relationship with the candidate in the interview, just as in a traditional one, setting them at ease and introducing the process and communicating maybe your key organizational values whilst establishing a positive rapport. The questioning should be considered too. So combining job-related questions with strategically informative lead-ins that enhance the candidate's understanding of your organization and the role while evaluating them in a friendly format. So informing them, but also extracting information you need to see if they're a good fit to the role. And when it comes to closing, interviews still have to make sure the interviewer maximizes offer acceptance by providing honest but encouraging responses to concerns, restating your differentiating organizational values and the role benefits, and to leave the candidate already picturing themselves in the role itself. So a beginning or the way to enhance the video interview is to introduce it properly, use the right types of questions, and close in the right way, just like in a traditional interview, actually. So, how can we help the interviewers? Let's take a look at what we might consider. So you remember, of course, the biases that creep in to interviews. So video interviews help remove some of the opportunity to gain first impressions based upon criteria having absolutely nothing to do with the role, because it helps maintain the structure of the actual interview. It also enhances standardization and consistency to try and alleviate some of the other biases and provide them with immediate criteria on screen to remind them of what exactly they're looking for. So the interviewer knows exactly what they're looking for. It's on screen. It's on-time guidance to help reduce that type of bias. Of course, the artificial intelligence can also evaluate aspects of the interview which may provide insights the interviewer has missed and may move them away from any subjective impressions they formed, as the other evidence does not confirm it. How will we do this? What will we do next? Well, preparing for the interview, from the interview, invitation to the interview, preparation for what to expect, what was done as part of an interview experience in the past, what would you actually do? So you would try to change the actual environmental distractions, and video interviews do tend to reduce the environmental distractions from a standard or traditional interview. It also helps with the additional scripting around helping not only prepare candidates well, but helping prepare the interviewer well for the interview itself and maintain support of standardization throughout. Of course, you also have to make sure that you train your interviewers well, not only in the interview process, but actually the technology being used as well. So moving then on to artificial intelligence. Let's take a look at this and try to remove some of the mysticism around artificial intelligence. We've probably all heard the phrase, but maybe we don't know what it is or how important it is going forwards. So some statistics. 71% of executives believe artificial intelligence and machine learning are game changers. 72% of business leaders regard artificial intelligence as a business advantage. And over half of executives believe artificial intelligence's greatest impact will be in the HR area. Now, interestingly, there is no universal definition of artificial intelligence, but the thread of the many definitions is that AI is the science and engineering of machines that can do tasks that have normally required human intelligence. It's any non-human analysis of participants' responses that utilizes potentially machine learning, natural language processing, or other related modeling approaches and techniques, such as deep learning, to assign scores to attributes of people, such as knowledge, skills, abilities, competencies, or to individuals' expected work outcomes, such as the probability of retention, etc. These types of approaches that artificial intelligence touches on are things such as asynchronous digital interviews, which you've already covered, or live synchronous digital interviews. So artificial intelligence can be applied to asynchronous or live interviews. It also touches on things such as situational judgment tests, the actual appraisals of resumes, CVs, and application form data. It can also be applied to various other works, assessment simulations too. So there's no real, at the moment, there's no real boundary as to what artificial intelligence can touch, but we have to ensure it's implemented in the right way. And what is that right way? Well, we'll come to that. Here, though, we will focus on artificial intelligence in interviews, but there are some key principles to be considered before applying the methodology. I've mentioned some concepts that maybe you'll ask me about later, such as natural language processing. We'll come back to those types of phrases later. They're all embedded in the artificial intelligence literature. Please ask questions about that later, and hopefully I can actually answer that. Things then to think about, key principles when trying to implement artificial intelligence. Artificial assessment is still an assessment. It still requires you to actually have evidence of reliability and validity, just like all other assessments. And employers' AI assessment programs need to be job related. So also, AI assessment should be explainable. So users and participants should be able to understand what is being assessed and how the AI assessment is job related. That comes to one of the ethical guidelines that SHL suggests when implementing AI is transparency. Understanding the overall process, you must be able to explain to people how your artificial intelligence works. There are lots of claims that require big evidence. So for instance, AI assessment adds new tools and possibilities to psychology, which has been studying talent for over 140 years, but these new approaches with the new claims still require due diligence and empirical support for their use, not just to use them without that evidence. So there are, of course, some barriers that need to be overcome for effective implementation of artificial intelligence. One of these is critical, which is the quantity and quality of data available to train the algorithms. This data may take the form of performance reviews, selection or promotion decisions, talent assessment data within the realm of HR. The data is critical because it needs large numbers, and it needs the data to be of high quality as well. When training your algorithms or your artificial neural networks, data is critical, data is king. The whole topic of ethical and appropriate artificial intelligence implementation is quite a large area, and we may actually deliver a webinar possibly on this subject separately in the future. For now, let's consider the advantages of artificial intelligence in the interview process. What can it bring that nothing else potentially can? So some advantages of the artificial intelligence algorithms and automation are that the algorithms or artificial neural networks, as we call them, can bring standardization to the rating of various types of criteria. It can be trained to standardize the assessment, to standardize the evaluation of candidates. These can combat the biases we've already discussed that creep into interviews and much of the hiring process, making the process more efficient, more predictive, and more fair. The AI can also be trained to evaluate areas such as social skills, where the evidence suggests and the research shows that the scores from artificial intelligence mimic the grades human experts would give to people for these types of human behaviors, such as social skills. So it mimics and actually shows the same ratings that a human expert would give. So the application of AI can aid in increasing the objectivity of any process whilst retaining the accuracy of the decisions made. With this in mind, artificial intelligence and digitalization are going to play a massive or significant role within the arena of talent management going forwards. This is where I'm going to leave it and ask if there's any questions from the audience about anything we've covered so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for this insightful presentation. Indeed, I completely agree with you. The world of work has fundamentally changed and proven by all the studies and the research we are recently seeing, in which, thank you, you've showed some of us today, some of the insights and the statistics you've showed us. For the sake of time, I'm just slightly just tracking the time, and for the sake of time, we've been receiving a few questions. Some of those questions are relatively similar, so I have combined a few of those questions, David, to you. The first question would be, let me go through it. Is there a need or a real need for video interviewing, or is it just simply a hype with the recent circumstances or with the current circumstances?
Okay, well, video interviewing was actually starting to be implemented pre-COVID. But of course, with COVID being as it is, and hopefully, inshallah, it'll be over soon, it actually has sped up the need for it, because virtual working is here to stay in various guises, and so video interviewing is too. But actually, it's not just a fad, because in large surveys, so for instance, PwC conducted a large survey in 2020, and it was found that digitization of the workplace and talent management were the main concerns of organization CEOs and senior management. So that clearly is congruent, because as the digitization of the workplace progresses, then clearly the digitization of the HR and talent management field must do the same. So video interviews help you do that, because not only do they digitize the interview, they can also help you reduce biases that face-to-face the biases that occur in face-to-face interviews, and can also give you additional data based on artificial intelligence scoring of criteria such as social skills, competencies, that you wouldn't get from anything else. So they're here to stay, they're not a fad, and if implemented properly, can really enhance your talent management practices.
Perfect. Thanks, David. A very interesting comment we had in the chat box with a simple definition of artificial intelligence, which says, artificial intelligence is simply delegate machines to perform tasks which requires human skills. That leads me actually to another question that was asked during our session. David, do you think that the video interviewing, or with the video interviewing, remove the human side of the selection process?
Well, I mean, it's a really good definition. They've put a nice short one. There is no actual, there's no one definition of artificial intelligence yet that's been agreed. There are different types of definitions, but they all come with in the same thread of, to their point, trying to do tasks that would typically take humans to do them, but do it in a way that's maybe quicker, more efficient, maybe even more predictive. It doesn't remove the human touch, though, because clearly, at the end of any process, it's a human that makes the decisions at the end. There's no artificial intelligence system yet that's been designed that could beat the Turing test, which means if I was talking to an artificially intelligent Diala and you weren't a real person, I could actually find out very quickly that you're not a real person and you're artificially intelligent, because they haven't designed an artificial intelligence system yet that can mimic humans as well as we can do things ourselves. What it can do, though, is help us do things that we potentially don't want to do ourselves too much. The mass data analysis of thousands of interviews, we really need to use the data to make the strategic decisions. There'll always be a need for very well-educated and experienced talent management professionals and specialists, but the data they have may change. The way they do their work may change, but it doesn't take the humans away. It just changes their job slightly. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, it does. Thanks. David, another question we have, which is quite interesting. Does artificial intelligence consider the body language of the applicant upon interviewing, or upon the assessment, or during the interview or the assessment itself?
It really depends on the type of artificial intelligence being used. So, for instance, yes, there are artificial intelligence systems that can do those types of things. However, they have to be trained well. And by trained, they have to have so much data applied to them to make sure that they can see any eventuality. I think maybe because body language can be different across different cultures and regions. You can also train an artificial intelligence system to take into account those differences so that it can be appropriate for the region in question. Also, something you may consider is looking at artificial intelligence in terms of the different languages being used as well. Maybe that's something to move forward in. Most artificial intelligence is designed using English right now, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case going forwards, as an example. So yes, it can look at body language, but you have to be very careful when you do it, that it's appropriate for the candidates being assessed and the region you're assessing in, because clearly there are nuances in how body language is interpreted and actually how people use body language in different regions.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, David. As well, we've got a question. I've combined two questions together. What are the new benefits of this platform, which is the video interviewing? And what do you think is the difference between this application or this tool and the normal video communication platforms like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc.?
So let's look at the differences between a normal Zoom and video interview platforms first. First of all, asynchronous interviews, of course, are much different in that Zoom, you can record what you're saying, but what it can't do that asynchronous video platforms can do is then try to attempt to analyze and score your responses based on strict criteria. They don't allow that in asynchronous. In live video interviews, although you can potentially do an interview through Teams or Zoom, it doesn't give you the enhancements that the interviewers really like, such as the questions are on hand on screen related to the competencies you need to assess. The ratings and behavioral indicators are on screen. You can rate people on screen as you go. Only you can see that. Candidates can't, of course, but it actually enhances the way an interviewer can use the system, and then all the data is on the system, so you can actually integrate your video interview platform with your applicant tracking system very seamlessly, so the data seamlessly goes into it, and you don't have to have such manual processes or repeat things just because you have to do some things manually. So that's in terms of the differences. There are significant benefits to a video interview platform because it has functionalities that Zoom and Teams don't. Also, of course, then going back to the first question, it would be, sorry, I've lost that first part of the question, was the benefits.
Yes, what are the specific benefits of using this platform or using video interviewing in general?
Well, obviously, with a video interview platform, you still have to ensure if it's live that the candidate still feels it's a good interview. But benefits are standardization. You standardize every interview because you use the same questions, the same indicators, the same way of rating across candidates, and the video interview platform digitizes that for you rather than shuffle thousands of pieces of paper, try to remember which questions you're going to ask. It's embedded in the system for you. So whenever you happen to have to interview anyone around a certain role, the questions are there for you and you can use them as you will. The ratings, of course, can be done against strict criteria, which can be identified and you can use them within the system as well automatically. One thing that can be done on good video interview platforms is you can tag the behaviors. As someone says something that relates to one of your competencies, you can tag it so that when you come back, and if you want to review your interview, if I'd interviewed Diala, I wouldn't have to watch all of the interview with Diala again to see if I've missed anything, because I've tagged certain areas of the interview that potentially link to certain competencies. I can go back and double check that I haven't missed anything. So it's a more intelligent way of recording and reviewing people's information. So there's benefits practically, but of course, using artificial intelligence as well, it can also give you information that a typical interview can't, because you might have ratings on social skills or persuasion or competencies or something that can link back to your ratings and see if you can corroborate what you would say about it with what the artificial intelligence scoring says about it. So you've got corroborative evidence as well. Of course, everything is within the system, everything can be linked, And going forwards, talent management processes will be highly linked and digitized. That's the way the trend is going. So it benefits you by being in line with strategies of business in terms of talent management processes. It's long-winded, but I hope that answered it.
Yeah, no issues at all. Thank you for addressing that. I think we have a room for one question, one final question. So the question is, what is the best software program that can be used for online interviews that are currently used in institutions?
What is the best online program?
What's the best software or program for video interviewing?
Is that trying to entice me to say that SHL is the best? I don't really want to go into the pros and cons of different vendors' systems. We're very proud of ours, at least obviously.
Yeah.
But
we'll take that as the answer.
Yes. Of course, when you're reviewing your interview systems, one you want to use, you have to make sure that it allows you to apply best practices to an interview and also provides ratings that you would expect to get in a natural or a more human-led interview process.
Perfect. Thanks so much, David. Really appreciate all the insights you shared with us today. We have a few more questions coming, but unfortunately, just for the sake of time, we're going to have to wrap up. Please keep all your questions coming in on the chat box, or you can share it with the team and the HR Club. We will definitely be happy and pleased to address all of the questions, and even have one of the people attending as well requested another session because it's a very interesting topic and they would like to learn more about it.
Of course.
So definitely we would be happy and pleased to coordinate with the HR Club, with the people at Fahar, the organizers, to hopefully, inshallah, to have another session to discuss in details as well the video interviewing and the AI element, artificial intelligence element.
Your pleasure, no problem at all.
Thank you all for attending. Thanks, David, for the session. Thanks, everyone, for attending our session today. And thanks for the organizers as well at the HR Club. We really hope that you found the session today informative and useful. And hopefully, inshallah, we wish to see you in our upcoming webinars and our upcoming sessions in the HR Club.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everyone.